Hello, everyone, and welcome to the sixth and final session in American English Live, Series 21. My name is Dr. Darlene Wiggins Dockery, and I will be your host today. Also joining us will be our moderator behind the scenes, my colleague, Elena, who will be responding to your comments and answering your questions during the webinar as well. We wanted to let you know that today's session will be recorded and shared across various platforms. By attending and adding your comments to the chat or comments during today's webinar, your name, your country, and or your comment may be included in the video recording. By participating, you consent to your appearance in the recording and its use for the purposes of FHI 360 and the U.S. Department of State. If you do not want to appear in the recording, please do not share any comments in the comments or chat boxes. Throughout Series 21, we have explored a variety of strategies for building academic skills for success and assessment in the English language classroom. We hope that you have been able to use these practical strategies that we share. So here's what you can expect today. The session is about 60 minutes long. The presenter will present the material, and I, as your host, will ask questions and comment as well. But we really want to hear from you, our audience, as you share your ideas, and so we can address them and your experiences. So please do share your thoughts in the comments and chat boxes. When our session comes to a close, you will have the opportunity to receive a digital badge for your participation. At the end of the webinar, we'll share a link in the comments. Click on that link and complete a short quiz about today's session. You must answer 2 out of 3 multiple choice questions correctly. And if you successfully pass the quiz on your first attempt, you can expect to receive your badge via email in about a week. Now for today's webinar, Improving Classroom Assessment for English Language Teachers. English language teachers are regularly required to assess the progress of students in their classes. What are some effective methods of assessing student achievement? In this interactive session, we will review some fundamental concepts of language testing and analyze how to build assessments that effectively measure student achievement in relation to learning outcomes. We will also consider ideas and tips for more effectively assessing students. And we are pleased to introduce our presenter, Joe McVeigh. Joe is an author and independent educational consultant based in Middlebury, Vermont, in the northeastern part of the United States. In the U.S., he has taught at California State University, Los Angeles, the California Institute of Technology, the University of Southern California, Middlebury College, and St. Michael's College. Joe is an active member of TESOL International Association and has served as an English language specialist delivering professional development workshops for the U.S. Department of State in a variety of countries. He is also an expert in the field of English language program accreditation. Joe's English language course books are used in many countries throughout the world. Welcome, Joe.
Well, thank you so much, Darlene. It's a pleasure to be with you today to talk about improving classroom assessment for English language teachers. And I wanted to say at the very beginning that we're really talking today about classroom assessment. Of course, there are other kinds of assessment like the TOEFL examination, the IELTS examination. Perhaps there's a national examination in your country. But today we really want to look at classroom assessment. So let's start off by looking at this word assess and assessment. Now, sometimes we use the words assessment, and sometimes we use the word test. Are these really the same? Well, I think what we can say is that all tests are a form of assessment, but not all assessments are tests, because there are other ways in which we can assess students' language ability. For example, writing an essay might be a form of assessment, or an oral interview might be a form of assessment. So while a test is always a form of assessment, not all assessments are tests. But I'd like to ask you a question, and that's this. What are some of the challenges that you and your students have with language testing and assessment? Perhaps you could write your answers in the chat.
Okay, so yes, right off the bat, we want to hear from you. What are some of the challenges that you and your students have with language testing and assessment? Joe, I love that you clarified that not all assessments are tests. So let's see what our participants say about their challenges. Let's see, so far, we are hearing from Mansoor, who says it's great to know the difference. Fahim said one of the challenges is lack of interest. And then Farhan said that one of the challenges is having to print a large amount of quizzes for students. And then we are hearing from Tahira, who said selection of the content is a challenge. So those are some of the responses that we have heard. One more from Jessam, who said different types of assessment can sometimes be a challenge. So back to you, Joe.
Well, I'm not sure we're going to be able to address everyone's challenges today, but I do hope that we'll be able to address some of those, and that by the end of the day, you'll have a better idea about classroom testing and assessment. So let's just quickly review the plan we have for our time together today. We're going to start off by reviewing fundamental concepts of language testing. Then we're going to analyze how to build assessments that measure student achievement in relation to learning outcomes. And then we'll consider some ideas and tips for more effectively assessing students. So let's start off by looking at some fundamental concepts of language testing and assessment. And I'd like to look with you at three different basic concepts or ideas. The first is to ask the question, what is the purpose of the test? The next is to ask the question, is the test valid? And we'll talk about what that means. And then the question, is the test reliable? So our first concept is that of purpose. What is the purpose of the test? And we can basically think of three different purposes that we might use for a test in the classroom. The first one is a diagnostic test. And for a diagnostic test, we want to find out what students know and what they don't know so that we can teach them more effectively. The second type of or purpose for a test would be a summative test or summative assessment. This is sometimes referred to as assessment of learning, and it's what we would usually do at the end of a unit or a course to provide information about what learners have achieved. And we often use this to give a grade or a score. And then a third purpose of an assessment is formative. And a formative assessment is really assessment for the purposes of learning. Usually it's an informal way of monitoring progress to identify strengths and weaknesses and focus on areas of improvement. So you can see the picture of this student who is obviously somewhat confused. And we know that sometimes our students don't understand everything that we teach them in class. So a formative assessment would help us halfway through the course learn more about what they do and don't know, and that would help us as we continue to shape the course in the future. All right, are you ready for a little quiz? A quiz is a very short and simple test that we use to usually just kind of very quickly get an idea of how much students have understood. So in this case, I'm going to invite you who are participating to answer these questions on your own, but I'm going to have Darlene stand in and be doing the quiz for you. Are you ready, Darlene?
I'm ready.
All right. So this test is a kind of matching activity, and in a matching activity, on the left you can see that we have some numbered points, and on the right we have some lettered points. So what I want you to do is to choose the letter on the right that provides the correct answer to the point on the left. So the first one, number one, what sort of a assessment is used to find out what students know to help design instruction?
Um, so our options are formative, summative, or diagnostic assessments.
Right,
And so to help our students know, it would be C, diagnostic.
right. So the answer number one would be C. A diagnostic assessment is used to find out what students know to help us design instruction, usually near the beginning of a course. Okay,
Mhm.
number two, what's an informal way to check on learning and help students improve during the course?
And this one's my favorite, the formative assessment,
The
because we did,
formative.
yes.
That's right. And we've had lots of webinars that have focused on the question of formative assessment, and I think that our participants can find those on the American English YouTube channel. So finally, which sort of assessment is used at the end of a unit to give a grade?
Well, I know the answer is summative, but just process of elimination, I would choose B.
That
Either
that
way.
That's right. It is used at the end of a unit. And here's an interesting idea. You see that in this case, in this matching activity, I have the same number of possible answers as I do questions. And so that by the last one, you could tell the answer without even necessarily knowing the answer. And one way that you can get around that is to have more options. What if there was a D? Then that would give, then you wouldn't be able to do that to sort of automatically know what the next one. So that was our first concept, looking at the purpose of the test. The next concept that we'd like to look at is the concept of validity. And to answer the question about validity, we want to ask, does the test really test what you think it does? A valid test is a test that measures what it is supposed to measure. And we can think of validity in three ways. First of all, content validity. Uh, the contents of the test reflect what has been taught in the course, right? It's not fair to your students to ask them to answer questions about ideas that you haven't taught them, right? So the content should be what has happened in the class. Secondly, construct validity. Construct validity means that the test design measures the ability to use language as it has been taught. So for example, if you're teaching a course in speaking and your test is all multiple choice or true false, students are not having to speak. So that test design probably wouldn't have construct validity. And then the last sort of validity that we talk about is called face validity. Face validity means that the test looks like it's testing the desired ability or content, especially from the student's point of view. You don't want the students, after you've given them the test, to say, that was not fair. That test didn't really test the things that we've studied in the class. So Darlene, let's do another. I'm sorry. Let's move on to another concept of testing, and that is the concept of reliability. Reliable basically means that the test is consistent over time. And to make sure that this version of the test is the same level of difficulty as the one that you gave last year or the one that you'll give next year, we want to make sure that the instructions are very clear. We want to make sure that the test assesses only what has been taught and that every student's performance is assessed in the same way. You can't apply a different grading scale to one student than another student. So you should use the same marking method each time the test is given, and you should be consistent in the ways that you offer the test. So for example, you should make sure that students have the same amount of time to complete the test each time that you offer it. So Darlene, let's have one more quiz on these fundamental concepts. Now, this time, the quiz is a fill in the blank activity. In American English, we say fill in the blank. In British English, they sometimes would call this a gap fill activity. So in this case,
Okay.
you have to, I'm not going to give you A, B, C, D. You need to come up with the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Participants, if you wanted to write your answers in as well, you can do that. But I'm going to get Darlene to be our student in this case. So what do you think for number one? It's important to know the of the assessment.
The purpose. It's important to know the purpose of the assessment.
That's right. We want to know why we're doing it, right? And then if a test measures what it's supposed to measure, we say it is
Valid.
we say it's valid, right? And valid can mean either sort of strong or truthful. And three, when an
Mhm.
assessment is able to give the same result over time, we say it is
Reliable.
reliable. You are a great student, Darlene.
Thank you ever so much.
I'm gonna give you an A and a gold star. So our fundamental concepts are the purpose of the test, validity, and reliability. Now, there's another thing we need to think about when we're giving students a test, and that is the impact of the test on students and teachers. When we give students a test, what effect does the test have on the students? And then what effect does the test have on teachers? And we sometimes refer to this effect as a washback effect. So this is kind of a technical term, and you can see the definition at the bottom here. So the washback effect refers to the influence that language testing can have on curriculum design or teaching practices or learning behaviors. So for example, teachers might teach to a test, or learners might focus on aspects of language learning that are likely to be assessed. And when we think about the washback effect, we can think about positive effects that a test might have. For example, students are going to study for the test, and it might influence the curriculum in a certain way. But we can also think of some negative effects of the washback effect. And maybe you've experienced this in your own teaching. So here's another question for you. How can we as teachers reduce the negative impacts of the washback effects in our own classrooms? If you have some thoughts on this, please share them in the chat.
Okay, well, Joe, while we wait for our responses to come in to our reflection question here, I do have some comments I'd like to share with you. We heard from Shabana, who said, yes, reliability and validity matter a lot. And then we heard from Saliha, who said, so true. When students do not understand the purpose of the test, they feel suspicious of the assessment. And then Fariha said that this is very, very informative indeed. So, again, back to our challenge question, how can we as teachers reduce the negative impacts of the washback effect in our own classrooms? Farhan said using a variety of assessments is one way that we can reduce the negative impact of washback. Iruma said make it a daily practice. Tima said, doing more applications beforehand. So, and then Jaliet, who we are hearing from, also said, focus on aligning, teaching practices with broader learning goals rather than merely teaching to the test.
Mm.
And then Naina, pardon me, said by using such teaching strategies that help students engage and learn from classroom. Then we heard from Mohammed, who said, get students themselves to write the assignment and give the reflection. So those are some of our responses, Joe. Back to you.
Well, I love those responses from people. And just remember, washback can have a positive effect, but we do want to try to limit the negative effect. So we've started off today by taking a look at some fundamental concepts of language testing. And now we'd like to move on and analyze how we can build assessments that effectively measure student achievement in relation to learning outcomes. Now let's start off by looking at what we mean by student learning outcomes. If you look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see a nice definition. A student learning outcome is a description of what the student will know or be able to do with the language as a result of the course of instruction, written in terms of observable and measurable language skills. Sometimes when teachers write these, they use this language. Students will be able to do something. And we sometimes abbreviate that by just using the first letters of each word of students will be able to, which is SWBAT. And if you say it fast, it sounds like SWABAT. Students will be able to. Let's take a look at some examples of some student learning outcomes. The first one here is for listening, and the outcome is students will be able to understand listening passages on familiar topics such as daily life. The next example comes from reading, and here the sample outcome is students will be able to identify main ideas and supporting details from an article at B1 level. And then here's a third sample student learning outcome from a speaking course. Students will be able to hold a short conversation about daily topics. So there are a lot of different ways that you as a teacher can test or assess your students, aren't there? Would you tell us what some types of tests and assessments are that you use in the classroom? Because there's such a possible variety of different tests and assessments. What kind of tests or assessments do you use?
Okay, so as we wait for our I'm sorry, our audience, our teachers' responses, I did want to share with you some of the comments that we are receiving. One from Farin is written exam. That is one of the types that this of assessments that are used. And then I see diagnostic tests from Maria. Michael said, student centered, focus on what the student will achieve rather than what the teacher will teach. Ambreen said, Kahoot is one of the types of assessments that are used in the classroom there. Hannah said, we have quick comprehension checks. Hayes said formative and summative mostly. Zara said productive and receptive skills. Pierre said reading comprehension. So those are some of the responses we've received. One more just came in from Shaw, who said criterion referenced test.
Hmm.
Back to you.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing those types of tests and assessments that you use in the classroom. Let's take a look at an overview of some common types of assessment. And I've broken these into different sections based on the question of what the student needs to do in order to complete the test. So in the first type of test, the student needs only to choose an answer, but the student doesn't need to produce language. So some examples of these types of tests or assessments would be a true-false questions, multiple choice questions, matching questions, which we did earlier, ordering, putting different items in the correct order, or identifying, choosing how things relate to each other. Number two, in this type of assessment, students need to produce a small amount of limited language. An example of this would be a fill in the blank or a gap fill assessment, which again, Darlene did for us earlier. Or short answer questions. There's a question, but the answer can be very short. Students don't need to write very much. The third type of assessment, students must provide extended answers and output. So in these cases, students have to produce quite a bit more language. And examples of these would be essay questions or longer open-ended questions or oral presentations, role plays, or interviews. And then finally, in the fourth category, these are examples of assessments where the students really must reflect on language and think carefully. Some people use a form of self-assessment or portfolio, which is where you collect a variety of work over the course of time, or a project in which students might be working either by themselves or with other students to produce some product, again, over a longer course of time. Darlene, when you take a look at these common types of assessments, how do you kind of distinguish between these different types?
Well, based on what will the student need to be able to do to be able to answer the question. So, like, for example, number one, as is pointed out, they only need to be able to choose the right answer, not produce the language for those types of questions. So again, it depends on what is your goal in the assessment? What is the outcome you are hoping that the student will be able to demonstrate?
That's exactly right. What does the student need to do? How much language do they need to produce? So, of course, if you're dealing with lower level or beginning students, you're not going to ask them to write long essays or give oral presentations. You're probably going to use some of the easier types of test questions. Now, something that we want to consider when we're thinking about which tests we want to use are what would be most helpful? So, for example, which assessment tools would give the most useful feedback to students? Which assessment tools are most likely to be motivating to students? Someone mentioned earlier that students sometimes are not interested in tests, but what would be motivating to students? What would make them want to study and want to learn? Which assessment tools are easier to design, administer, and score? Now that's something to think about for you, the teacher. And then which assessment tools would give you the most direct information about a student's performance? Well, the interesting thing is that sometimes the assessment tools that give the most useful feedback to students are not the tests that are easier to design, administer, and score, right? If you want to give students a lot of feedback, it might well be that would be more difficult to design, administer, and score. So we can see that sometimes there's kind of a little bit of a disagreement here between what is most useful for the students and what is easier for the teacher. And that's something that you need to think about as in terms of your own teaching. Well, let's get back to our idea about student learning outcomes. And I want to show you an example student learning outcome here, which is the one we looked at for listening. Students will be able to understand listening passages on familiar topics such as daily life. So for this learning outcome, students will be able to understand listening passages on familiar topics such as daily life. We're trying to assess listening. How might you assess this outcome? So the outcome again is students will be able to recognize common words and phrases in listening passages on familiar topics. What do you think would be some good ways to assess this student learning outcome?
Okay, so we want to hear from you. And while we're waiting for your responses to come in, I wanted to share this comment with you, Joe, from Michael, who said giving effective feedback to students is crucial for their growth and learning.
Mm.
To maximize its impact, feedback should be clear, specific, actionable, and timely. So,
Mm.
again, we're waiting for your responses. How might you assess this outcome? Students will be able to recognize common words and phrases in listening passages on familiar topics. So, Bat said, Seg, please pardon me for butchering your name. We appreciate your input, though. Said answer questions about daily life. That said Seg. And then Samina said listening comprehension exercises. Manahel said feedback and quizzes. Lone said fill in the blanks. So these are all ways that they would um, assess this outcome. So Rab said while reading passage. Hamid said by playing a video. Celine says perhaps only choosing among options or fill in short answer.
Mm.
So those are some of the responses we've received. Back to you.
Great. Well, now you want to remember, everyone, that we're talking about a listening activity. So probably if you want to make sure that in order for your assessment to be valid, that needs to make use of the listening skill. So that's something you want to bear in mind. And if we're thinking about building effective assessments, let's look at an example of one way in which we might try to assess this learning outcome. So I'm going to show you an example here, which comes from um, a series of materials developed by Nancy Ackles and the American English team, and it's called American Teens Talk. It's a wonderful set of interviews with American teenagers. And there's some listening passages and some texts. And in this case, the unit theme is daily routines, activities, and hobbies, also time. The language skill is listening. And we looked already at the learner outcome, which is students will be able to understand listening passages on familiar topics such as daily life. Let's take a look at the directions that we would give the students. The student's name is Haley. She's 17 years old. And the directions say, listen to Haley discuss her busy schedule in an interview. Then write a paragraph summarizing Haley's morning, afternoon, and evening routines. Be sure to include key times of day when her activities take place. So we're going to listen to a small part of the interview with Haley. So listen carefully and see if you could answer this question. Write a paragraph summarizing Haley's morning, afternoon, and evening routines, including the times of day when her activities take place. Let's listen to Haley talk about her day.
What have you been doing this week?
Well, mostly all of my days start with getting up at 6:30 and going to the pool to practice with my year-round swim team. At 8, I head over to another pool to coach a swim team. That's one of my part-time jobs. I finish at 11 and get home around 11:30 or so. Usually I go home and eat lunch and get my relaxation for the day.
What do you do in the afternoons?
After lunch, I usually go back to the pool, either to lifeguard or to hang out with friends. I love to catch a minute, if I can, to read.
So that was Haley talking about what she does during the day. Uh, let's see if we can answer this question. about the purpose of the test. So if we move on, you'll remember that earlier we talked about different purposes of assessments. Darlene, what do you think is the purpose of this test?
Well, it's a listening test, so we want to assess whether the students can meet that outcome.
Exactly right, right. We have that learning outcome. Students will be able to understand listening passages on familiar topics. And you'll recall that when we first started off talking about different purposes of tests, we talked about three kinds: diagnostic tests, formative tests, and summative tests. And while I think that we could use this test item for almost any of those purposes, because we're trying to assess the extent to which students understand the student learning outcome, this is most likely to be a summative test. However, we find that many teachers in their teaching make use of multiple choice tests. And a multiple choice test has several parts. First of all, there's the question. And the example here is Juan likes to play, and that part of the question is called the stem. And then we have the possible answers, and the possible answers are called response options. And the correct answer in this case is basketball. Juan likes to play basketball. And the correct answer is called the key. And then there are the incorrect answers, and the incorrect answers are called the distractors. Now, teachers like to use multiple choice questions. They're often used, but they're often misused. And there's some very common errors that teachers make in writing items for multiple choice tests. One is there's more than one correct answer. Maybe both answer B and answer D could both be correct. Another is grammatical inconsistency in the response items. The possible answers have different grammatical structures. Sometimes the distractors or the wrong answers are really unrealistic. They're not at all similar to the correct answer. And then sometimes these questions can test more than one thing. Let's look at an example multiple choice question. See if you can tell us what you think is the problem with this test question. And please share your answer in the chat. So the directions say circle the answer, and the stem or the main part of the question is Haley spends a lot of her time, and the possible answers or response options are A, at swimming pools, B, reading, C, swimming and coaching, and D, apple. So what is the problem with this test question?
Okay, so I see lots of problems. I'm sure you do as well. What is the problem with the test question? We have Haley spends a lot of her time, and that we have those four options at swimming pools, reading, swimming, and coaching, and then apple. Let's see. We've heard from Farhan, who says it's not specific. Um, we heard from Betty that says all can be answers. We heard from Masaru, who says apple doesn't make sense. Waharat says swimming and coaching. Monica said letters A and C are correct because she goes to the pool to practice and she also coaches. So I think our participants have kind of figured out some of the problems with this test question, Joe.
Great. Well, let's take a look at what some of those common testing errors are. In fact, there were several problems with this question. And the first one is that there's more than one correct answer. It would be correct to say Haley spends a lot of her time A, at swimming pools. That's correct, both grammatically and in terms of content. And also it would be correct to say Haley spends a lot of her time swimming and coaching, C. So there's more than one correct answer. We want to make sure that there's only one clearly correct answer. Secondly, many people pointed out that answer D, apple, has nothing to do with the rest of the item. So this distractor is unrealistic, and we don't want to use distractors that are clearly wrong because they point towards the correct answer. And then thirdly, some people also pointed out that there is grammatical inconsistency in the response items. We really want those response items to have the same grammar, the same grammatical pattern. We want to make sure that there's grammatical consistency in those response items. And then here's one more thing, one other testing error here, and that is testing more than one thing. If we look at the various aspects of grammar in this test question, there are different things that could be testing, right? Because the answer A is really checking whether students are using the correct articles and the correct verb tense. Answer B is looking at word order. Answer D is looking at word order and tense. So we don't want to try to test students on multiple aspects. So we really want to make sure that there's just one thing, one concept that we're working on. So let's look at how these questions could be constructed in a better way. So look at question 1. Haley spends a lot of her time, and then our response items options would be hanging out with friends, reading, swimming and coaching, or relaxing. So in this case, the response options all are using the same grammatical function. They're all more or less related to the topic, and we're really testing the same thing. So we're really only testing here that students understood that Haley spends a lot of her time swimming and coaching. So this is a much better written test question. Also, question 2, well, most of my days start, and here you'll notice again, we're using the same grammatical pattern. We're not testing more than one item. None of the distractors are unrealistic. This is a much better test question. So Darlene, do you think that this test would be valid? Remember, that was one of our concepts that we started off with. Is this test testing what it's supposed to be testing?
Yes, it is. This version of it is indeed valid because
And
it is doing what it said, it testing what we say it's supposed to be testing.
do you think this test is also reliable?
Reliability is based on whether we can get the same results if we do the test again. So we don't know that yet. We'd have to give it again to see if we got the same results to know if it were reliable.
That's right. I think that this test is better constructed, and so that makes it somewhat more reliable. But as you say, we would need to give this test again in order to see just how reliable it is. So we've been looking at some different ways of putting tests together, and especially in relationship to student learning outcomes. Finally today, we want to consider some ideas and tips for more effectively assessing students. So here's a question for you. How do your students respond when you tell them there will be a test or an assessment? Maybe you could share your answers in the chat. How do your students respond when you tell them there will be a test or an assessment? Do they get very excited about it? Are they enthusiastic? Are they so thrilled that there's going to be a test? Oh, Betzig says they feel sad. They
Yes.
feel sad. Yeah. Sometimes they do. Or sometimes Marija says her students are upset. Bibata says hers are excited. So that's great. They get excited about their test. Or sometimes Farhan says his students get more concerned about their studies. And then someone says it's terrible and they cry for help.
Oh
And then
my gosh.
they hate tests, says Midori. And Cedar Shakil says they feel stressed. It's a big deal for them. So perhaps they look a little bit like the student in the next slide who really does not look very happy at all about having to take a test. And this, we know, is how some of our students respond when we tell them that there's going to be a test. So let's think about how we could try to help lower student anxiety. And you can see here this pencil in which students are encouraged to inhale, breathe in, and exhale, breathe out to try to relax. So some things that we can do to help lower student anxiety are to give them practice tests ahead of time so that they know what tests are going to be like. We can help them with timing. Some students have trouble when they're taking a test because they either rush through it so quickly that they don't give careful answers, and some other students take such a long time that they sometimes don't finish the test. So we want to help them understand the timing. And of course, we want to encourage students to review before they take the test at all. We'd also want to make sure that our assessment is fair to the students. We want to make sure that we've clearly communicated with them what's expected of them. We want to make sure that they're aware of how the grading scales work. And then we want to make sure that we are giving students meaningful feedback about the results, because that's an important aspect. Another thing that we want to do to help lower a student's anxiety, or really this is more lowering teaching anxiety, is to think about how practical the assessment is to administer. Think about how long is it going to take students to complete the test? How complex or complicated are the instructions? And how long will it take you as the teacher to correct or assess the answers? You might want to think about what resources are needed. Do you need to reserve a special space at your school to give this test? Do you need technology? Are students going to take it on the computer? And what could possibly go wrong? You want to try to anticipate those kinds of things before they happen. Well, let me give you just a few more tips for making and administering assessments. As someone pointed out in the chat earlier, it's very helpful to use different ways to evaluate students. Don't just use one type of test or assessment all the time. Use a variety. Secondly, you want to use test types that are familiar to students from classroom instruction. You want to introduce them to those test types in class. Third, when you are weighting the relative importance of questions for scoring, think about what it is that you really want the students to learn. Now, the term weighting here usually has to do with points. How many points will you give to this question or this part of the test? How many points will you give to this part? You don't want to give a lot of points to something that really isn't very important in your course. But number 4, you do want to give students a clear idea of the number of points per section and the expectations for their response so that you can encourage them to use their time and manage their time well. Just a few more tips for making and administering assessments. Number 5 would be to try to use authentic language texts and communicative tasks with rich content. So by authentic language texts, we mean language that comes from the real world, not language maybe that comes out of a textbook. It's a good idea also, number 6, to ask another teacher to practice taking the test to find any issues. We know, number 7, that some of our students are not always honest when they're taking the test. Sometimes there are problems with cheating. But you can use the same basic test for maybe different sections of the class, but put the questions and the answers in a different order. This makes it more of a challenge for students to share their answers with each other. And then you could also write different but very similar questions where students would need to use the same language in order to respond to the question. Finally, something that you can do with your students is after the test is over, you can invite students to reflect after the test, to think about how difficult they found the test, what was easy or difficult about it, how they prepared for it, why they made mistakes, and what they could do next time. And we have for you a downloadable version of this test reflection form, and you can find that in the chat. Where you can copy this post-test reflection form and make use of it in your own classes. So let's just review what we've done today. We started off by reviewing fundamental concepts of language testing. Then we analyzed how to select types of tests that more effectively measure student achievement in relation to learning outcomes. And finally, we considered some ideas and tips for more effectively assessing students. So Darlene, we have one last question for our participants. And that,
Okay.
why don't you read it for them?
Okay, so that question is, what is one idea from this webinar that you will remember and use in your own classroom assessment? So we're looking forward to hearing those answers because it's really important to us to know that you can implement what we are presenting to you right away, tomorrow in your classroom even. So let's see what some of your responses are so far. All right. We have heard from Maria. She said she's learned that not all assessments are tests. Babata said the validity of the assessment is something that they will keep in mind when they are in their classroom next. And then Betta said the washback effect. That was a new concept that they will keep in mind in the classroom. So those are some of the responses we've received.
Well, that's great. And I hope that this webinar has been helpful to you. And I just wanted to share a few references, which are useful books and articles that I found helpful in preparing this webinar, and that could give you some more information and ideas about classroom testing and assessment. So I wanted to thank you all very much for coming and paying attention to the webinar. Thank you.
And we want to thank you, Joe, for giving us such insightful tips for how we can gauge our students' achievement.